So we've been working on the thumbnails, right? Oh gosh, I really just fixed this. I put a new battery and everything. And it was working. Oh, I know why. Okay, there we go. So we've been working on our thumbnails, so you should be about to this point. And last week we took pictures of the different facial features in the colored light, so you guys have kind of like a library to choose from of different facial features at different angles with different color combinations. One of these that we have drawn, one of the ones that you have drawn, is going to then become your actual painting, where you're going to develop it into like a full-fledged composition. And in order to do that, we're going to have to add some color. Okay, so I kind of breezed through this. This is very defeating. I don't know why that is like that. We kind of breezed through this the first time that we kind of went through the slides. So now that we have a better understanding of the composition, so you guys have been spending time kind of thinking about where to put your features and how to make things feel balanced and how to make the composition interesting using all of the different perspectives, all of that stuff. So color is going to be our next step with that. So you guys are familiar with the color wheel, yes? The idea here is that the color wheel is a way of organizing the colors in a particular order that will show us how some of the colors will react in our painting and when we use them in combinations with other colors. So obviously you guys know, and these aren't my favorite color wheels, but they had all the schemes in one image, so that's why I used it. The idea here is that I usually put the yellow on the top because the yellow is the lightest color on the color wheel. And then opposite of yellow is, do we know? Purple, yes, very good. And then purple is the darkest color on the color wheel. So there isn't really like a right or wrong way to display it, but I put yellow on the top and purple on the bottom because it's lighter at the top then, and then as you work down the color wheel in either direction, then it gets darker as you work your way down. So just kind of mentally put that in the back of your head. The idea here is if we look at different combinations of colors, where those combinations come from on the color wheel makes a difference. And it tells us about how those colors are going to kind of react with each other and react with other colors. So for example, a monochromatic color scheme, mono means how many? One, very good. So a monochromatic color scheme means that it's using only one hue. So the hue is like when you go around the color wheel, what are the different colors called? So red, yellow, blue, green, whatever. Those are hues. So monochromatic means that it uses one hue or one color, plus typically in a color scheme we include all of the tints and shades of that color. So shades of white mixed in with that color to make like pastel versions. And then theoretically, in color theory, we can say that a shade of a color is that color mixed with black, okay? So tints and shades of that color are included in a monochromatic color scheme. So monochromatic would mean that we're using one color plus lighter or darker versions of that color. When you look at a composition that has one color plus some lighter or darker versions, what is the overall effect of that that limitation when there's only one color? How do you think that might affect what your painting looks like?
It's just going to be one color.
It's just going to be one color. Yep. How might that make your painting look?
Not really any variety.
Not a lot of variety. Exactly. Good. And we're going to be talking about unity and variety a lot today. So if we only use one color, we're going to have a lot of unity because we're going to have to repeat that one color or shades and tints of it that are very similar. So when there's a lot of repetition, it creates a lot of unity. That can be a good thing because it can make it feel very cohesive and very related. But also, what happens when we have too much unity or too much repetition? It looks what?
Bland.
Bland, boring. When you have too much of the same thing over and over again, you get tired of it, right? So keep that in mind. Okay, when we use monochromatic color scheme, now using more tints and shades could help, that could add some variety, but when we only have one color, we're kind of limited in that way. If we start spreading out that little area of the color wheel that we're going to use, okay, if we now include 3 colors that are what we would call neighbors if we were in elementary art, we're going to increase the variety a little bit. Does that make sense? So we're using more colors, but because they're so close to each other still, they are still very, very related, right? So there's not going to be a lot of contrast. It's going to be colors that are still similar. There's a little bit more variety than a monochromatic color scheme, but it's still going to feel very cohesive, very related, very easy to balance. They're still going to feel like they belong together. Okay, it's kind of like there's siblings and there's family members. They're related. They're not twins. They're not like matching, but you have a little more variety there. Okay. The others are going to be ways to add more contrast and more colors. So the farther apart that those colors get on the color wheel, the more different from each other they're going to be. Therefore, the more contrast they're going to have with each other. Okay, so the next step, and I know these are in this order just because they're on this graphic together, but the next step in increasing contrast, if we go from monochromatic to analogous, is actually going to be triadic, because that's using the same number of colors as analogous that are now evenly spaced throughout the color wheel. So a triadic color scheme is going to be much more variety. Now we have 3 colors, they're very far apart on the color wheel. They are really not technically related at all, especially this particular color scheme because this is red, yellow, and blue. Those are the 3 primaries. They have nothing to do with each other at all. They are their own separate entities, right? So that's a lot of contrast. Compared to analogous and monochromatic, how would this be to balance? Is it going to be hard to balance or easy to balance?
Hard.
Relatively speaking, it's going to be hard compared to those other ones. Why is this one going to be harder? Why is triadic harder?
It's difficult to mend the colors and make them work together.
Yep. Because the farther apart they are on the color wheel, the more different the colors are. And the more different they are, the harder it's going to be to get them to relate to each other in terms of your painting. Okay? Now there's other strategies for how you apply the paint and where you apply the paint, and we'll get to that, so that you can balance a triadic color scheme. Like, it is possible, and it's not necessarily that hard once you kind of understand what's going on. It's just about being able to know how the colors are going to interact with each other. Okay? The most contrast then is going to be the complementary color scheme. And why would the complementary color scheme be the most contrast?
It's on opposite ends of the color wheel.
Exactly. They are the farthest apart that 2 colors can possibly be on the color wheel. So they're complements. Complements is another word for opposites. You're going to need to know that. Do you guys have a pretty good working understanding of what the complements on the color wheel are? Okay? You're going to need to know that a lot because typically when we work with colors, it tends to be stronger. Okay? Not every time. This is not like the golden rule, but in the back of my mind, this is kind of how I process things. It tends to be stronger to use complements to blend your colors and to create shades, even though they're technically not shades, versus using black and then mixing black in with your color. Because black in a color, or white with a color for that matter, they tend to make the color flatter, whereas if you use the complement of the color, it keeps like the vibrance and the life of the color. It keeps it a little bit more dimensional and a little bit, keeps a little more depth in the color versus kind of flattening it out. Okay? So I'm kind of talking about 2 different things. I'm talking about blending complements in order to like create shadows or things like that. But then in terms of the color schemes, like when you use colors next to each other in your painting, complements are going to be harder to balance. They're going to be harder to make them feel related to each other. But because there's so much contrast, if you put 2 complementary colors next to each other, Do you know how they, like what they do to each other? There's so much contrast between those colors that they actually make each other look more vibrant because they're next to something that has so much contrast from it. Does that make sense? So if we look at, I'm trying to think if there's a good example on this page. If we look at like these two colors or these two colors next to each other, even from, especially from the distance that you guys are at, they look pretty similar, right? Like if you squinted, you might not even be able to tell the difference between them. But because there are so much difference between these two colors, if we put them next to each other, the yellow would appear a little bit more vibrant, the purple would appear a little bit more vibrant because of what's called local contrast or environmental contrast, meaning like what it's paired near. Okay, does that make sense, at least in theory? Okay. These other ones down here, split complementary and tetradic, are a way to keep the contrast of those complements of having that distance on the color wheel, but then also kind of pull in a little bit of the familiarity of the analogous color scheme. So like a split complement is basically like two analogous color schemes. It's like two contrasting analogous color schemes. So you have a little bit more variety, a little bit more unity in that you have colors that are close to each other, but then also variety of the contrast. And then same thing with a tetradic. Another word for tetradic is a double complement because basically it's like 1, 2 complementary color schemes. But because these are close-ish together, there's a little bit more unity, again, to help it feel related, but still have the contrast of those opposing colors. So does that make sense how the structure of where the colors come from on the wheel are going to come across, are going to affect your painting? Okay, so the gist of that is for each of your thumbnails, for each of your 8, okay, just pretend. For each of your 8, okay, on the thumbnail sheet, I'm going to encourage you to use like colored pencil, something quick and easy, and that still blends a little bit. I don't need you to color like every single thumbnail, every single fragment shape, but I do need you to think of for each thumbnail, pick a color scheme, okay, so either I wouldn't recommend using a monochromatic, but either an analogous or a complement or a triadic. If you want to try the split complements, the tetradic, you can do that too. They're a little bit more to think about because there's more colors involved, right? But the idea here is that we're going to start laying in color, okay, and these are thumbnails, so it's rough, like it does not have to be perfect or careful by any means. But I want you to start experimenting with where you're putting those colors and how you're contrasting to make the portrait now stand out from the background, yet still feel related as part of one composition. Does that make sense? So if we look back at some of the original exemplars from the artists, okay, what color scheme is being used in this one?
Triadic.
Triadic, yep. And why do we know that? How do we know that?
The 3 primary colors.
3 primary colors, yes. So just so you know, any 3 equidistant colors on the color wheel can be a triadic color scheme. So just because it's a triadic color scheme doesn't mean it has to be red, yellow, and blue. Okay? So if you shifted all those colors over one, you could have like red, violet, blue, green, whatever the other third one is. And I would recommend, again, this is not like a hard, fast rule, but as like a general rule, I try to avoid just like straight out of the bottle flat use of the primary colors. I try to at least put a little something in them so that they kind of can have a life of their own. That just tends to elevate the complexity of whatever you're doing. Again, that doesn't apply necessarily in every case, but because of that color scheme, because there's so much going on in the background, there's so much like pull from each of those colors, it forces the eye to pull the portrait part forward because there's so much flatness in the background and there's so much contrast happening in the background that it pulls itself away from like the face part. Does that make sense? Okay. So rowdy. What color scheme would you say this is?
Triadic again.
It feels triadic, right? Because it's kind of
Tetra.
tetradic, maybe. We see orange and blue. We also see yellow. So we've got some of that pull from across the color wheel. The fact that there's red and orange and brown means that there's some kind of analogous element happening, because brown goes where on the color wheel again?
Orange and like dark orange.
Yep. So brown is basically considered orange on the color wheel because it's technically a shade of orange. So it's a darkened version of orange. So the fact that we have yellow and red and orange means that we have that analogous element. We have that analogous section. But then we also have a couple of different blues. Okay? So this would probably be like a split complement or a tetradic, you're right. And then it's creating that contrast with those complementary elements. Okay? And then if you're using like this particular skin tone, what would that be considered on the color wheel? What hue?
Yellow.
Could be yellow. Could also be
Orange.
orange. Yep, somewhere in that range. So kind of be thinking about that. Now, do you have to use a natural skin tone? No, you don't. Okay, so that might be where some of your colored pictures come in, because you have the skin tones that were colored by the colored lights. So you can be as faithful to what those photos look like as you want. So if the photo has purple and green, you can use purple and green like the photo, or you can change it to whatever other color you want in your painting and still use the features. Does that make sense? Okay, so our basic goal with the color is two things. We want to make sure that we're contrasting the face, the portrait part of the work, with the background. Come on. Okay, and then also we want to make sure that we're blending realism with abstraction. So this is where you're going to have to start picking which of your fragments are going to be more realistic and which are going to be more abstracted or stylized or I guess flatter, although we want to kind of avoid flatness. So take a look at the sheet that I gave you. This has your learning targets on the front side. So I will review and recognize historical works by Cubist artists. We did that the first time we went through the slides. So you saw the work of George Braque and Pablo Picasso. I will compare and contrast historical Cubism with contemporary post-neo-Cubism. We did that as part of the early slides as well. I will design a portrait that visually fragments facial features and blends realism with abstraction. So that's a big one. So you need to decide which of your features and which fragments and sections are going to show more realism and which are going to show more abstraction. Okay? Which means that not all of your facial features have to look real. So keep in mind, like Picasso, early Cubism, where an eyeball was like kind of like a check mark, angular mark with a an oval in the middle. So you can do that in some of your fragments if it makes sense with the rest of your composition. Okay? And then I will use composition techniques to create a variety of engaging and balanced compositions. So make sure that you're reviewing in the slides the part that we talked about way in the beginning, where we talked about the principles of design. So things like contrast, proportion, movement, rhythm, unity, variety, emphasis, and balance. Okay? Balance, all of these we're going to continue into other projects, but balance is going to be probably the one that we refer to the most and think back to the most. But keep these in mind as you're going through, particularly as you're evaluating moving forward, which of these you're going to then take and carry forward into an actual painting. Make sense? Okay, flip to the rating side. So it's a 100-point project. Most of your major projects will be. So 20 of those points comes from your design is appropriately detailed, complex, and challenging, and appropriate for a high school skill level. 20 points comes from the principles of design, so these guys, are applied for a balanced and engaging composition, okay? And so not only are you applying them to your painting, but then also you're able to explain what difference they're making in your work. 20 points for all required facial features are incorporated in an original and unique way. 20 points for your composition incorporates a balanced blend of realism and abstraction. So it's not too much realism and it's not too much abstraction, but it's a good balance that makes sense for what you're doing. And then 20 points for multiple layers of paint cover all surfaces. So in other words, no blank surface shows through, including edges and corners, and your painting is presentation quality condition. Okay? So I'm not grading you on a color scheme per se, but how that's going to kind of follow through to your final project is, are you using enough balance between unity and variety in order to make your composition interesting, but also in order to make the portrait stand out from the background, but also relate to it and blend with it. So there's that kind of happy medium in a couple of different areas that you need to decide how you're going to do. Does that make sense? We feel like we know a little bit more about color? Okay, so for today, like I said, I would use colored pencil if you want to try something else. Like it's the first time I'm doing this project, so I am totally open to you experimenting and then providing feedback and seeing what the best way to do it is. I'm thinking colored pencil because you can kind of blend it and it's quick. And it doesn't have to be super neat, but take a process photo first of your black and white version, but start putting then, after you take a photo, start putting some color in so that you can experiment with what colors might go well where and how you're going to balance those colors. So for example, if I'm putting like a red section down in the lower left-hand part of my painting, I'm also going to want to repeat red somewhere else so that it feels balanced, right? You wouldn't want to just put like one chunk of color and then not repeat it in other places. So start to kind of lay out that color, start to see what combinations feel like they relate and they contrast adequately, and then they feel balanced. And then once you have all 8 at least colored in some way, then we'll move forward, decide what your strength is and what your strongest of your 8 is, and then we'll do any fine tuning to take that idea into the fully developed painting, which will extend into next week. Questions? Okay. Don't forget your process photo though. I would do that before, well, I would do that now, but then also before you add any color to it.